Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Queen Elizabeth was the longest-serving monarch in British history.
People around the globe are mourning the passing of Queen Elizabeth II.
Charles III became king at the moment of his mother's passing.
God save the King!
God save the King!
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. The United Kingdom is still in a period of national mourning following the death of Queen Elizabeth II last week. Her funeral is to take place on Monday, which Britain's new king, Charles III, has deemed a public holiday. The period of mourning and state funeral gives people a chance to come to terms with the death of the country's longest reigning monarch. As head of state in what is a constitutional monarchy, the Queen touched everyone's lives much of the time. In fact, far more than many of us realised. It's fair to say the death of Queen Elizabeth II has affected British people in many different ways. If the endless lines of people lining up to pay their respects are anything to go by, the vast majority of British people will miss their dear sovereign.
Well, it's an end of an era, isn't it? There's no doubt about that. Yeah, she stayed the course.
To someone who's led us, guided us with humanity and courage.
Difficult going to words, the emotions just too much. Sorry.
When you just actually saw the coffin with the flag and the crown on top and the round of flowers, and it just made you realise just how special she was to everybody.
But you'll also find indifference and even some rare examples of hostility towards the royals. Videos of the odd person protesting near the Palace of Westminster and near the cathedral in Scotland where the Queen had been lying in state. Another shouted abuse at Prince Andrew as he followed his mother's coffin. These are unusual moments in the physical world, but there are many, many more examples of negative and critical commentary online. Nevertheless, after 70 years on the throne, few can remember a time when she was not head of state. Unlike so many British politicians, the Queen was seemingly a permanent part of British life, a sentiment best expressed by the recently deposed Prime Minister.
Millions of us are trying to understand why we are feeling this deep and personal and almost familial sense of loss. Perhaps it's partly that she's always been there, a changeless human reference point in British life, the person who, all the surveys say, appears most often in our dreams, so unvarying in her pole-star radiance that we have perhaps been lulled into thinking that she might be in some way eternal.
And that is why, for some, the Queen's passing is a shock, even though she was 96. Continuity, though, is the key. And immediately upon her death, her son became king, rising to the apex of Britain's constitutional monarchy.
I am deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty.
In Britain's version of a constitutional monarchy, the king or queen is the head of state, but doesn't make laws and is not political. The government makes the rules and runs the country in the monarch's name, but that's only really a courtesy. The sovereign is more of a symbol with plenty of influence but no real power. To quote the historian Walter Bagehot from the 19th century, the Queen reigns, but she does not rule. So what's the point then? Let's return to Boris Johnson once more, who describes with much admiration the ubiquity of the monarch.
And think of what we asked that 25-year-old woman all those years ago, to be the person so globally trusted that her image should be on every unit of our currency, every postage stamp, the person in whose name all justice is dispensed in this country, every law passed, to whom every minister of the Crown swears allegiance, and for whom every member of our armed services is pledged, if necessary, to lay down their lives.
The former Prime Minister is not exaggerating when he went on to say the Queen was the figurehead of our entire system, the keystone in the vast arch of the British state. The Queen's image, or the crown, the symbol of the monarchy, is everywhere in British life. Criminals are prosecuted in her name and then imprisoned at her pleasure. Battleships are named after her. Businesses carry her royal warrant seal of approval. Postboxes have her initials on them. And even London's newest train line is named after her. Not to mention that Britain's monarch is the head of the Church of England, the head of the Commonwealth, which includes 54 nations and 2.5 billion people. She was also the head of state of 14 other countries outside the UK, including Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And now the vast task of succession, of transition begins. Much will change, everything from coins and stamps to portraits and postboxes. But might the changes go deeper still, as Britain and the Commonwealth moves from the era of Queen Elizabeth II to that of King Charles III? We'll be looking at all the issues raised in that report in a moment with our constitutional expert, Bob Morris. We'll also be hearing from Sello Hatang, who is the Chief Executive of the Nelson Mandela Foundation in South Africa. But first, as is our tradition here on Nexus, we're going to give the first word to the public. And this week we sent our producer Salahuddin as close as he could get to Buckingham Palace, where people were gathering to pay their respects to the late Queen.
What did the Queen mean to you?
Well, she was just part of my whole life ever since I was a child. I'm nearly 50, and I've only ever known the Queen. She's part of our whole heritage, part of our country, part of everything, really.
I come from Kenya, the place that she ascended to the throne. And therefore, it's a different approach for me. She was my queen at the time. Times, again, in today's world, it's a totally different scenario. So what she means to me today is something totally different to what she meant to me during the time when she was in the colonies.
Somehow the Americans have been fascinated with the monarchy since, I think, when we had our revolution.
What advice would you give to the new King, Charles III?
I think he's got to recognise that things are changing, and I think he does recognise that, and I think he has to make the monarchy, if it's going to last, move with the times and be fit for purpose.
Well, some good advice for the new king, perhaps. Let's bring in our constitutional expert now, Bob Morris, who is an honorary member of the Constitutional Unit at the University College London. Bob, let's start with looking at the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Some say it is even greater than the first Elizabethan era. How would you assess it?
Well, there's certainly been more social change, and there's been some political change. The monarchy, Elizabeth II started by appointing the Prime Minister, in the sense that she selected him or her. But that power is gone because the parties themselves appoint their leaders and negotiate if there has to be a coalition. So the limited political powers that Elizabeth started with have further diminished.
And what makes a great monarch? If she is so highly rated, what made her so?
I think it's a number of things, isn't it? It's retaining political impartiality, and it's being not only the head of state, but also head of society. And what Elizabeth has done is reinforce the service and welfare roles of the monarchy to a great extent, and something which I've no doubt whatsoever that the new king, Charles III, will run with too.
You talk about her being head of society, indeed any British monarch will be, and for some people in society, for some entire sections of society, she just was not relatable. Let's take a look at the Catholic position, for example. It was only in 2013 when the law prohibiting the monarch from marrying a Catholic was abolished, and that was 60 years into her reign. And even now, the monarch can never be a Catholic, according to the Succession to the Crown Act. Would you say the institution is inherently sectarian and anti-Catholic?
Well, it is open to that criticism. But you may have also noticed that Elizabeth made a very important speech in 2012 when she reviewed, as it were, her work as supreme head of the Church of England, and took the view that its present task was to act not to defend its own position, but to act more as a protector for all the other religions that are now on our shores. And Charles, as a Prince of Wales, made statements in a very similar vein. And it's interesting that in Belfast, for example, at the cathedral service, he was introduced first to all the religious leaders present in the Northern Ireland.
Let me ask you about Charles then, Charles III now. His strengths and weaknesses. He's always lived in the shadow of his mother, and maybe he always will. But does he have his own strengths to bring to the job?
Well, it's very difficult if you've been around for a long time. Elizabeth, we knew very little about her personal views, but of course we know quite a lot about the 73-year-old who has succeeded. But we also know that he is a conscientious man who tries to think thoroughly about the issues of the day. And some of the issues which he gave attention to, like the environmental and climate issues, have now become fashionable. He got there with his father first. So he deserves that credit. He also deserves the credit of some of his charities, which have been remarkably adroit in the way they have targeted young people, particularly young people who've fallen through the cracks of our society. And these are merits that should not be overlooked, and which perhaps we shall see more of during his reign.
Can I ask you about some of his limitations or weaknesses, perhaps? We're asked to believe now, and I've heard it said many, many times on British television, that he's a highly intelligent man, now the head of the Church of England, and as we've seen him today and in many, many other days, wearing military uniform, which is highly decorated. I would only say that we know that he left school with, 6 O-levels and 2 very mediocre A-levels, but was then allowed to enter, Cambridge University. Head of the Church of England, this is a man who, caused an enormous scandal in the 90s with his adultery. How is it that people in this country are supposed to look up to him without performing some mental gymnastics to elevate him to that level?
Well, there we are. At least he's human. And these failings, if they are failings, are human failings, and we should be able to identify with those. And we see a man who is, whatever his capacities, determined to address his role as king. And in his first 2 speeches to the public, I think people detected strong emotional feeling and attachment and thoughtfulness. And those are qualities that one could want in any head of state.
Well, you say that. Bob, you say that. Now we're supposed to take his deficiencies as attributes. But when Her Majesty served for 70 years in an incredibly conservative and unimpeachable style, we were to say, well, that was a great quality. And now we're asked to think that Charles has great qualities because of his weaknesses and deficiencies.
Well, I'm not sure that we expect great intellectual qualities necessarily in the formal sense, but the fact is that he is a very thoughtful and determined man, and that he has shown good qualities which would qualify him for being head of our society under the extraordinary arrangements that we have. And it is true, of course, that he is an hereditary monarch, but the important point about that is that it means that his political impartiality is a great gift to our political society. And it is rare among heads of state that they have a political clean sheet.
Okay, you have said that democracy and constitutional monarchy are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they go together rather well. I want to bring to your attention a couple of examples of people expressing their freedom of speech. We saw people with placards. They were very, very limited in number, I confess, but they did happen. Some people were arrested and some people were charged. Now, commentators and others will say, what kind of a constitutional monarchy / democracy are we living in that people can't show signs saying this is not my king or abolish the monarchy? What happens?
Well, those are very serious charges. And of course, we are a free society. And if people are charged, then they'll be brought before the courts. And it's for the courts to decide whether the charges should be proved. I think in some cases, people were arrested and then released without charge.
Yes.
I think there is, at least in one of the cases, some thought that there was a breach of the peace in the sense that a couple of people were sloganizing for a republic, which we are a republic, however, and in a crowd of people with very different sympathies. And there was some danger. I think a couple of them were decked, put to the floor.
Yes.
And the police very sensibly intervened, to protect these individuals.
Support.
But there's often a clash between prevention and cure. And it's very difficult for the police to make the right judgment in these circumstances.
Bob, just a final question for you. Support for the monarchy is at around about 60%. In favour of being a constitutional monarchy. Now, it's still quite substantial, but it's the lowest level ever. And the Republican movement is still quite small, but growing. Do you see it gaining a great deal of momentum now that someone of that great stature has gone and Prince Charles has become King Charles III?
Well, I imagine that those who favour republicanism, out-and-out republicanism, presumably they need some presidential figure rather than a monarch, they will hope to gain from the present situation. And it is also true that, of course, no institution, monarchy or otherwise, has a right to continue despite all circumstances. So we shall see this debate, no doubt, is taking place in some of the realms already, that is the Commonwealth countries that all have retained the king as head of state, and no doubt we shall see it in this country too. We have had this debate before, of course, in the 1640s.
Bob Morris, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. Thank you. Well, let's get reaction from a former British colony now, South Africa. It gained independence in 1961, left the Commonwealth that year, and then rejoined in 1994 when Nelson Mandela became president. Well, let's go to Johannesburg now, and Sello Hatang joins us. He worked with Nelson Mandela as a chief executive of his foundation from 2008 to 2010, and says Madiba knew the Queen pretty well. We're going to get onto that in just a moment, Sello. But first, what is the reaction from South Africa to the Queen's death?
Well, South Africa's reaction has been very diverse. And in our case, as the Nelson Mandela Foundation, because the Queen was a friend of this institution and also a friend of Nelson Mandela, we conveyed our deepest condolences to her passing, and want to again say to her people and those who consider themselves her to have been their queen, that your loss is felt deeply by this institution because of the relationship that we've enjoyed. Other parts of South Africans, of course, as you can imagine, either were very indifferent to her passing, or that they felt that the damage caused by colonialism is something that can't be ignored.
Interestingly, Nelson Mandela, when he became president, or the year he became president anyway, it was one of his priorities to bring South Africa back into the Commonwealth. Why would he want that?
I think because institutions like the Commonwealth were institutions where maybe in two ways. One, Madiba did say that he was a firm believer in the English way of doing things. And I think if one can judge by that kind of him admitting that he was more for the English way of living and working, it means that he wanted institutions that could support that, but also that he thought, I would believe that you'd have a fairer chance of fair trade, that you'd be able to be connected with those that would have maybe suffered similar kind of from the same kind of base of colonialism, or that you can rebuild from the damage that was caused using the very same platforms that caused the damage in the first place.
Is it true to say the Queen and Nelson Mandela had a lot of mutual respect?
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, Matt, one of that kind of respect and I would say fondness that they enjoyed between the two of them is demonstrated in how they would call each other on a first name basis. Ahmed Kathrada, who spent 26 years in prison with Nelson Mandela, tells of a story of how he walked into the office once and he found Madiba speaking to an Elizabeth, that Madiba was kept on saying Elizabeth this, Elizabeth that. And when Madiba put the phone down, Ahmed Kathrada asked him, what was that? Who was that person on the line? He said, it's Queen Elizabeth. He said, shouldn't you have said Queen or your Majesty or something like that? Madiba said, well, if she can call me Nelson, it means that I should be able to call her by her first name too, Elizabeth.
Fair enough.
And that's the kind of relationship they enjoyed. But also, Matt, if I tell you of a story of how Madiba, when he received the Queen in 1995, it rained heavily in South Africa. And Madiba then bestowed on her a name in my mother tongue called, and he called her Motlalepula, which means the one who brings rain. And you don't just confer names like those when you don't have a special relationship with someone.
Yeah.
And I think that was demonstrated in those instances, amongst many others.
That's a very nice name to call her. I don't think I've heard the BBC refer to her as that, but they probably can't pronounce it. Sello, looking to the future, and King Charles III. What do South Africans make of him?
You know, I met King Charles III. In fact, we hosted him here in Nelson Mandela's office where I'm sitting at the moment. And I found him to be a person who was very generous in his responses to people's questions, and even how humble he was in his conduct towards us. And I think if I would even venture to share anything with King Charles, it would be to ask that maybe he try do the difficult work of reckoning. Because when you find yourself in a position where you can continue to build on a legacy as big as this one, as that of Queen Elizabeth, it then is upon you to do the reckoning work, to work with those that feel that a lot more can be done to reconcile English history with those that feel that they were harmed by it. And my word to him is, may the future continue to shine bright on you, so that you then try build the Britain of the future that can then build into, for those who are still to be born, to find the Britain that then cares deeply about people who continue to suffer. The British government's conduct, for example, the treatment of refugees, that has really irked me a lot personally, because if you are to look at the conduct of the British government, it's something that maybe King Charles, even though he's a ceremonial king in this instance, but he has influence, is to ensure that the British government understands that how it's viewed in other parts of the world.
Let me ask you a final question. Quite a lot of spiteful comments as well on Twitter and elsewhere on social media. People say some really nasty remarks about the Queen and the fact that she's dead. Nelson Mandela, very philosophical man, a great one for forgiveness. What would he say to these people online, these tiny, tiny little people compared to him? What would he say to them to get them to be a little bit more philosophical, forgiving, and humane, perhaps?
You know, Matt, I never liked speaking on behalf of Madiba. Even when I was the spokesperson, I conveyed exactly what needed to be conveyed coming from his desk. And in this instance, I would want to resist speaking on his behalf. However, I think he would want us all to have more generosity. That at a time like this, you need to be more generous. That you recognize that a person tried to rebuild from the damage that was caused. I mean, for someone like Queen Elizabeth to have stood up against Margaret Thatcher, to say that apartheid was bad and we needed to then do something with the sanctions, need to be recognized as much as you recognize the damage that came before her time. And I think you would most probably be standing here saying, I think your generosity is lacking. And at a time like this, when someone who really was a global leader in many respects, well respected, you need to then accord them that dignity, that the death needs not, let us not have the respect that we need to always have. And I think that respect Madiba's had, and his reconciliatory manner, means that all of us need to at least try to emulate some of those values. And if we are to do anything like that, it means that each one of us, Matt, must try our best to be better than those we think might have cost us the hurt and might have cost us the kind of terrible damage that we believe that would have been caused. And that generosity means that we go the extra mile and say, at a time like this, let's observe that a life has been lost. And each one of us must ensure that those who are her family feel that they feel our solidarity.
Thank you, Sello. Much appreciated from Johannesburg. Thank you. Well, let's turn to something a little lighter now and take a look at this painting. This was done in 1995 by Christian Furr. He was just 28 years of age at the time. He was the youngest artist to ever paint a portrait of the Queen. It now hangs in the public foyer of the Royal Overseas League in London. And we're fortunate enough to be joined by Christian Furr now. Christian, thank you so much for joining us here on the Nexus. Let's start by asking how you were picked back in 1995, was it, to paint the Queen's portrait? You were so young.
Well, it came about through a Commonwealth organisation of which the Queen was patron called the Royal Overseas League on St James. And Her Majesty had seen a painting that I'd done there, and suddenly I got this call out of the blue to say that the Queen would like you to paint her portrait. So for a young man, it was an amazing experience to, an amazing call to take.
And you went to see her for 2 sittings, is that right?
I did. I had 2 sittings at the Palace, and I drove up there in my red VW Beetle and had the guards laugh at me when I arrived.
Right. And how did you find her? How many hours did you spend with her in each sitting?
I had about an hour and a half with Her Majesty, an hour and a half to 2 hours, and she was very chatty, very lively. She had a great sense of humour. And at the end of the sitting, she actually said, have you got everything you need? Do you want any more time? And I thought that was very generous, but I think that was very indicative of her as a person. She was very generous with her time. She was very accommodating, and she realised that the people around her and artists were there to record her legacy.
Was she happy with the end result?
She wasn't officially allowed, I don't think, to comment on any of the depictions that were made of her. But a few years later, I personally met the Duke of Edinburgh, who took a print of the painting. So it makes me think that it was appreciated. Just looking at the painting, there's a little blanket on the side there. Can you tell us the significance of that, why you didn't tidy up the shot? Yeah, it's a good point. Well, I think with paintings and with art in particular, chance things happen, and they can add or reveal something about the character of the person that you're painting, if it's a portrait. And in this case, after waiting, a few nervous minutes for the Queen to arrive in the yellow drawing room at the Palace, she eventually came in, and she had like a shawl or a blanket with her, and she said, "Do you mind if I put this on the side of the chair?" And I said, "No, that's fine," because straight away I knew that told me something about her personality. It reflected an aspect of her personality that was very important in the final mix of the image that was going to capture her life.
And did you say it indicates sort of vulnerability to the Queen?
Well, I never like to put specific meanings on things, but you could read it as that, and we're human beings after all, we're fragile, we have vulnerabilities, and the Queen was like everybody else, I think.
It was harder to believe of the Queen. In fact, most people thought in this country that she'd go on and on forever. So it was a good detail to capture. Can I ask you about a previous portrait by, is it Annigoni, an Italian artist back in the 50s? Apparently, you said to her, "You look rather haughty in that portrait." How was that received, that remark?
That's right. When I think back now, I kind of think, why did I mean, you do things when you're younger and you kind of think, why did I do that? So that was when I wasn't really...
She understood, right? She understood. And what was her explanation?
She did. She just didn't blink, and she knew the painting I was talking about, and she said, well, just as you're asking me to look out the window now, Annigoni did the same thing, but the window that I was looking out of then, there was a very high wall outside the window, and I ended up straining to look over to see what was on the other side of the wall, and I thought that was very funny.
Christian Furr, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with the Queen with us today on Nexus. Much appreciated. From an artist to another artist, you see, a chef, if you like. The Queen celebrated her Platinum Jubilee in June this year, and we caught up with her former private chef, Darren McGrady, who spent over a decade serving Her Majesty. And many guests, including Princess Diana, Prince William, Prince Harry, and of course, 5 US presidents, from Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George Bush Sr. and Jr., and Bill Clinton. Here's what he had to say.
One of the things I learned cooking for the Queen was that she's not a real foodie. She eats to live rather than lives to eat. So it was really difficult putting different dishes on the menu, trying to get her to try new foods and new dishes. She just had her favorites. And we know that she's a chocoholic. She loves anything dark chocolate. So anything that was dark chocolate, I could put on the menu and could be sure that she'd say, yes, I'll take that. But she also loved game off the estate too. So any pheasant, partridge, venison, salmon from the River Dee, she loved to have that on the menu. I think she liked to share with the guests that this is from the River Dee, this is from my estate, this is from my gardens. So I think she used to enjoy that. But one day I do remember I actually suggested a new dish. I was running out of ideas. She loved to eat fruit in season, and it was strawberry season at Balmoral. And I remember finding a recipe in a local newspaper, and it was called A Veiled Farmer's Daughter. And it was a beautiful strawberry dish with yogurt and like a muesli on the top. So I wrote it in the book and sent it up, forgetting that the Queen, if you suggest a new dish, she needs to see the recipe. So there was a note in the book that came back down the menu book, and it just said, who or what are the veiled farmer's daughters? I had to send the recipe up quick. I think one of the things people don't realize about the Queen is how frugal she is. And I think that, you know, growing up in the war years, I think that food was scarce, and she carried that on through a whole 70-year reign, I think, certainly with eating. And I think that when I started working for the Queen, I thought, oh, this is going to be so much fun. She'll be eating foie gras and caviar and lobster every night. I mean, she's the Queen. She can have whatever she wants for dinner. But it was actually quite the opposite. We'd do a state banquet, and of course we'd bring out some caviar or lobster. But the rest of the week, it was plain and simple eating. Some grilled chicken, some grilled fish, no dessert, just a piece of fruit. So she was very simple in her eating. And for me, cooking for the Queen, especially when she was on her own, was always so much fun. And we would be at Sandringham, and the Queen would just walk past the kitchen window with the window open and stop and just look in and say, thank you, that was a lovely weekend. And that meant so much to us as a chef. I mean, it really did, that we'd got to cook for the Queen and that she'd enjoyed it.
The royal chef Darren McGrady there on the sometimes unexpected pleasures of cooking for the Queen. Well, thank you for watching. If you want to see this programme or any of our previous programmes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.